The Force speaks in whispers and thunder, in dreams that haunt the sleeping mind and visions that sear themselves into waking consciousness. For millennia, those who wielded the dark side of the Force did not simply react to the galaxy around them. They sought to see beyond the present moment, to pierce the veil of time itself and glimpse what was yet to come. The prophecies of the Sith Lords stand as some of the most powerful and dangerous predictions ever recorded in galactic history, shaping the destiny of countless worlds and determining the fate of entire civilizations. Unlike the Jedi, who approached prophecy with caution and humility, the Sith embraced these visions with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They believed that knowledge of the future was not merely a gift, but a weapon, a tool to be mastered and exploited. The ancient Sith did not simply wish to see what was coming. They wanted to control it, to bend the very fabric of destiny to their will. This fundamental difference in philosophy would echo through the ages, creating a legacy written in shadow and blood. The nature of prophecy and the dark side. To understand the prophecies of the Sith Lords, one must first comprehend how the dark side itself enables visions of what is yet to come. The Force, that mystical energy field binding all living things, exists beyond the constraints of linear time. It flows through past, present, and future simultaneously, an eternal river of possibility and potential. Those sensitive to the Force can sometimes catch glimpses of this vast temporal ocean, seeing fragments of events that have not yet transpired. But the method by which one accesses these visions matters profoundly. The Jedi taught their members to quiet the mind, to become vessels through which the Force could speak. They emphasized patience, acceptance, and the understanding that visions were gifts from the Force itself, not commodities to be seized. Master Yoda, one of the wisest Jedi to ever live, frequently reminded his students that the future was always in motion, that what they saw in visions represented only possibilities, not certainties. The Jedi approach was fundamentally passive, rooted in the belief that one should receive what the Force chose to reveal, nothing more. The Sith rejected this philosophy entirely. They viewed the Jedi approach as weakness, as a failure to grasp the true power available to those bold enough to reach for it. Where the Jedi waited for visions to come to them, the Sith actively hunted for knowledge of the future. They developed techniques to forcefully extract information from the Force, to wrest prophetic visions from the fabric of time through sheer application of will and dark side power. This aggressive approach came with significant risks and rewards. The dark side, fueled by passion, emotion, and the raw hunger for power, created a different kind of connection to the Force. Sith Lords who mastered these techniques could peer farther into the future than most Jedi ever managed. They could see with terrible clarity the potential outcomes of their actions, the likely responses of their enemies, the weak points in even the most carefully laid plans. This ability to see ahead gave them an enormous advantage, allowing them to manipulate events years or even decades before their designs came to fruition. Yet this power came at a terrible cost. The dark side did not offer its gifts freely. The visions it granted were often clouded by the very emotions that enabled them. A Sith Lord's own desires, fears, and ambitions could warp what they saw, transforming objective glimpses of possible futures into distorted reflections of their own obsessions. Many Sith became trapped by their own visions, so convinced of what they had seen that they failed to recognize when circumstances changed, when the fluid nature of the future shifted beneath their feet. The ancient Sith understood this danger, and they developed elaborate systems for recording and interpreting their prophetic visions. They created the holocrons, those mysterious pyramidal devices that could store not just knowledge, but actual interactive recordings of Sith masters long dead. Within these holocrons, they preserved their prophecies, each one carefully documented and analyzed. The Sith built temples on worlds strong with the dark side, places where the barrier between present and future grew thin, where prophecies might be more easily accessed. One of the most significant aspects of Sith prophecy was its relationship to the ancient language known as Urkitat, or the Old Tongue. This language, which originated with the Sith species on Korriban, possessed unique properties that made it particularly suited to recording prophecies. The structure of Urkitat was such that small changes in inflection, in the break between words, or in emphasis, could completely alter the meaning of a phrase. What might read as a promise of glory in one interpretation could become a warning of doom in another. This linguistic complexity was not accidental. The ancient Sith lords who first codified their prophecies in Urkitat understood that the future itself was multi-layered, that prophecies needed to be flexible enough to account for different paths through time. They deliberately crafted their predictions to be open to multiple interpretations, knowing that the exact fulfillment of any prophecy would depend on countless variables. In this way, the language itself mirrored the nature of prophecy, creating texts that were simultaneously clear and obscure, certain and uncertain. The Galactic Republic, recognizing the danger these prophecies posed, eventually banned the translation of Urkitat entirely. They programmed protocol droids to refuse to translate the ancient Sith language, hoping to bury these dangerous predictions and prevent them from influencing future generations. Yet, like the dark side itself, the Old Tongue refused to die. It persisted in ancient holocrons, carved into the walls of forgotten temples, whispered by those few dark side cultists who kept the old ways alive even after the Sith themselves seemed extinct. The prophecies survived because they held power, because they spoke to fundamental truths about ambition, destiny, and the nature of power itself. They endured because, again and again throughout galactic history, they proved accurate in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. The prophecies of the Sith Lords were not mere superstition. They were glimpses of a future that powerful Force users helped to create, self-fulfilling predictions that shaped reality through the very act of being believed and acted upon. Consider the difference between how a Jedi and a Sith might approach the same vision. A Jedi Master seeing a glimpse of darkness ahead might meditate on it, seek the guidance of the Force, and ultimately take action only if convinced it aligned with the greater good. They would remain aware that their vision showed only one possible future, that their very knowledge of it might change the outcome. A Jedi would try to serve the Force, not command it. A Sith Lord encountering the same vision would react entirely differently. They would analyze it for advantage, seeking ways to turn even a prophesied disaster to their benefit. If the vision showed their own death, they would work tirelessly to prevent it or cheat it. If it showed opportunity, They would manipulate events to ensure that opportunity manifested exactly as they desired. The Sith saw prophecy not as guidance, but as intelligence, raw data to be exploited in their eternal quest for power. This fundamental difference in approach helps explain why Sith prophecies took the forms they did. They were not gentle suggestions or warnings. They were declarations, pronouncements of what would come to pass delivered with absolute certainty. The prophecy of the Sith'ari did not say, "There might come one who could be free of limits." It stated flatly that such a being would arise, would lead the Sith, and would make them stronger than ever before. The doctrine of the dyad did not suggest that two beings might share power. It proclaimed that such a connection represented the ultimate expression of Force potential. These prophecies became cornerstones of Sith belief precisely because of their certainty, their refusal to acknowledge that the future could be anything other than what they declared. This certainty gave them power, made them more than mere predictions. They became templates that ambitious Sith lords would try to fulfill, patterns into which they would force themselves and the galaxy around them. In this way, the prophecies actively shaped the behavior of those who learned them, creating a strange loop where knowledge of the future helped to create that very future. The dark side thrived on this paradox. It fed on the passion and ambition of those who sought to control their own destinies, who refused to accept that anything lay beyond their power to shape and command. The prophecies became tests, challenges thrown down across the centuries, daring each new generation of Sith to prove themselves worthy of the titles and powers they claimed. To know the prophecies was to be judged by them, to have one's entire existence measured against the impossible standards they set. The Sith'ari, the dark side's chosen one, long before the Jedi spoke of their chosen one, the Sith had their own prophecy of a perfect being who would arise to lead them to ultimate victory. This prophecy, preserved in ancient texts dating back thousands of years, spoke of the Sith'ari. The very name commanded respect and fear in equal measure, representing the highest aspiration of Sith philosophy. To be the Sith'ari was to transcend the limitations that bound even other Dark Lords, to achieve a state of being where power flowed without restriction or boundary. The prophecy itself, as recorded in fragments recovered from Exegol and other Sith strongholds, painted a picture of transformation and supremacy. The Sith'ari would be born of the Force itself, possessing power beyond any who came before. They would be free of restrictions, unbound by the weaknesses that plagued lesser beings. Most significantly, the prophecy declared that the Sith'ari would lead the Sith and destroy them, and through that destruction would make them stronger than ever before. This paradox lay at the heart of the prophecy, making it uniquely challenging to interpret. How could someone simultaneously lead the Sith and destroy them? How could destruction result in greater strength? For millennia, Sith scholars debated these questions, each generation offering new theories about what the prophecy truly meant. Some believed it spoke of a physical destruction, a culling of the weak that would leave only the strongest Sith to rebuild their order. Others interpreted it metaphorically, suggesting that the Sith'ari would destroy the old ways and create something entirely new. The prophecy's ambiguity ensured that numerous Sith lords throughout history claimed to be its fulfillment. Each brought their own interpretation, their own understanding of how they embodied the characteristics the ancient texts described. These claims were not mere vanity or self-aggrandizement, though such motivation certainly played a role. They represented genuine belief, the absolute conviction that one had achieved the state of being the prophecy described. Darth Bane, architect of the Rule of Two, believed himself to be the Sith'ari. His reasoning possessed a certain compelling logic. Had he not destroyed the Brotherhood of Darkness, the massive Sith organization that had grown weak and corrupt? Had he not led the Sith by creating an entirely new philosophy that would guide them for the next 1,000 years? Through the apparent destruction of the Sith, reducing them from an army to merely 2 individuals, had he not actually made them stronger by eliminating the infighting and weakness that had plagued previous incarnations of the Order? Bane's claim rested on his understanding of Sith nature. He recognized that the Sith would always fight among themselves, that their very philosophy of seeking individual power inevitably led to destructive internal conflict. The old Sith Empire had fallen not primarily to Jedi might, but to its own internal contradictions. Dark Lords backstabbed each other, hoarded knowledge instead of sharing it, and ultimately spent more energy fighting fellow Sith than battling their supposed enemies. Bane saw this as the greatest weakness of the dark side, the flaw that prevented the Sith from achieving their full potential. By instituting the Rule of Two, Bane destroyed the Sith as they had existed for millennia. No longer would there be armies of Sith warriors, no grand temples filled with acolytes, no fleets bearing Sith banners openly through space. All of that was swept away, replaced by a simple mandate: one master, one apprentice, no more. The master would embody power while the apprentice would crave it, and when the apprentice grew strong enough, they would kill their master and take an apprentice of their own. In this way, the Rule of Two would force each generation of Sith to become stronger than the last, creating an ever-ascending ladder of power. This interpretation of the Sith'ari prophecy emphasized the transformative destruction aspect. Bane did not believe he needed to destroy the Sith in the sense of ending them forever. Rather, he destroyed one version of the Sith to create something new and more powerful. The Sith that emerged from his reformation were indeed stronger, more focused, and ultimately more successful than their predecessors had been. The millennium-long plan that would culminate in the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire began with Bane's radical restructuring. Yet even in his own lifetime, not all Sith accepted Bane's claim to be the Sith'ari. His own apprentice, Darth Zana, had reason to question it. After all, the prophecies spoke of being free from limits, but Bane himself was killed by his apprentice as the Rule of Two demanded. How could one truly be free of limits if death remained an absolute boundary? How could the Sith'ari fall to someone else's blade? These questions suggested that perhaps Bane was merely a herald of the true Sith'ari, preparing the way, but not embodying the prophecy's complete fulfillment. As the centuries progressed and the Rule of Two continued, other Sith Lords considered themselves potential Sith'ari. Each brought their own achievements and interpretations. Darth Plagueis, whose mastery of the Force extended to manipulating the very building blocks of life, certainly possessed powers that seemed to transcend normal limitations. His ability to influence midichlorians to create life and prevent death represented a level of control over the Force that few, if any, had ever achieved. Yet, Plagueis also fell, killed by his own apprentice in fulfillment of the Rule of Two, suggesting that he too remained bound by certain limits. The prophecy took on new dimensions when beings in the late Republic era began to connect it with another ancient prediction, the Jedi prophecy of the Chosen One. According to historical texts recovered from Exegol, both prophecies spoke of a being born of the Force itself, someone who would wield tremendous power and fundamentally alter the balance of the galaxy. The similarities were too striking to ignore, leading some scholars to conclude that the Sith Ari and the Chosen One were not opposing prophecies, but rather two interpretations of the same prediction. This revolutionary idea suggested that somewhere in the ancient past, before the schism that created the Sith, there existed original prophecy that both Jedi and Sith had inherited. Each tradition had interpreted this root prophecy through the lens of their own philosophy. The Jedi version emphasized bringing balance to the Force and destroying the Sith, framing the prophesied one as a savior who would restore harmony. The Sith version emphasized freedom from limits and transformation through destruction, framing the same figure as the ultimate Dark Lord who would perfect their order. Emperor Palpatine, also known as Darth Sidious, came to believe that Anakin Skywalker represented the fulfillment of both prophecies. Evidence recovered from Exegol, including annotated scrolls from Palpatine's private collection, reveals that the Emperor studied the Sithari prophecy extensively. He believed that Anakin, born of the Force itself, with a midichlorian count higher than any previously recorded, possessed the raw potential the prophecy described. More significantly, Sidious saw in Anakin's life a pattern that matched the paradoxical nature of the Sithari prediction. Anakin did lead the Sith, serving as Darth Vader for decades and helping to establish the empire that represented the ultimate triumph of Sith philosophy over the Jedi way. He did destroy the Sith, not once but twice. First, by helping to eliminate the Jedi Order, he destroyed the Force that had kept the Sith in check for millennia, paradoxically weakening the Sith by removing their defining opposition. Second, and more literally, by killing Emperor Palpatine, he destroyed the last of the Sith Lords, ending the lineage that Darth Bane had established 1,000 years earlier. And through that destruction, Anakin did make the Force stronger. By ending both the Jedi Order as it had existed and the Sith as they had been, he cleared the way for a new understanding of the Force to emerge. His children, Luke and Leia, would create a new Jedi tradition, one not bound by the rigid dogmas that had blinded the old Jedi Council. The Force itself could flow more freely, no longer constrained by the ancient conflict between light and dark that had raged for thousands of years. Yet Sidious's interpretation of the prophecy was fundamentally self-serving, a fact that should surprise no one familiar with Sith nature. The Emperor believed Anakin was the Sithari because he thought he could control Anakin, could use the Chosen One's power to achieve his own immortality and eternal rule. Palpatine saw his prophecy not as something that would supersede his own ambitions, but as a tool he could exploit. He believed he could direct how the prophecy manifested, ensuring that Anakin's role as Sithari would serve Palpatine's goals. This arrogance, this certainty that he could control the very workings of prophecy, represented the same flaw that had plagued Sith Lords for millennia. They believed that knowledge of the future gave them power over it, that seeing what was coming meant they could shape it to their will. Palpatine's failure to foresee his own death, his shock when Vader turned against him at the crucial moment, demonstrated the limits of even the most powerful Sith foresight. The prophecy would be fulfilled, but not in the way the Emperor anticipated. The Sithari prophecy, in its complete form, represented more than a prediction about a single individual. It embodied the core philosophy of the dark side itself, that through destruction comes renewal, that power justifies any action, that freedom from limits represents the ultimate achievement. Every Sith Lord who claimed to be the Sithari was, in a sense, trying to become the perfect embodiment of their own ideology, to prove that Sith philosophy could produce a being of unlimited potential. But the prophecy also contained a warning, though few Sith recognized it as such. The requirement that the Sithari destroy the Sith suggested that ultimate power required letting go of the very identity that defined them. To truly be free of limits meant being free of even the label Sith, of even the dark side itself as a category separate from the light. The prophecy hinted at a transcendence that went beyond the eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith, pointing toward a state of being that embraced the Force in its totality. Anakin Skywalker's path embodied this paradox perfectly. He served both light and dark, destroyed both Jedi and Sith, and ultimately achieved a state of Force consciousness that transcended the categories that had defined him in life. Whether this made him the Sithari depends entirely on how one interprets the prophecy. From a certain point of view, as the wise sometimes say, he was both the Jedi chosen one and the Sithari, fulfilling dual prophecies by destroying the systems that had created both predictions in the first place. The search for the Sithari shaped Sith behavior for thousands of years, driving Dark Lords to ever greater extremes as they sought to prove themselves worthy of the title. It influenced decisions about who to train, which Force techniques to master, how to structure their pursuit of power. The prophecy became a mirror in which the Sith saw reflected their own desires and fears, a test by which they measured their own significance against the vast sweep of galactic history. The doctrine of the dyad and its transformation, hidden in the deepest chambers of the Sith citadel on Exegol, carved into walls that had stood for thousands of years. Ancient runes told of a connection so profound it seemed to transcend the very nature of the Force itself. This was the doctrine of the dyad, a prophecy that predated the Sith Order and perhaps even the formal establishment of the Jedi. Its text, written in the flowing angular script of Ur-Kittet, spoke of two beings sharing a bond that could not be broken, a union so complete that they became, in essence, two halves of a single whole. The prophecy of the Force dyad described a phenomenon rare beyond measure. Throughout galactic history, spanning millions of inhabited worlds and countless Force-sensitive beings, true dyads appeared perhaps only once in an age. These were not mere Force bonds, which allowed individuals to sense each other across great distances or share emotions and thoughts. A dyad represented something far more fundamental, a connection woven into the very fabric of the Force itself, present from the moment of the participants' births. According to the ancient texts, beings joined in a dyad shared a unique relationship with the Force. Where individual Force users could access its power to varying degrees, a dyad could amplify and combine their connection in ways that approached the infinite. The prophecy suggested that two who shared this bond would have access to abilities beyond the reach of even the most powerful solo practitioner. They could share life force across any distance, communicate instantaneously regardless of separation, and manifest force powers that neither could achieve alone. The doctrine of the dyad, as it was preserved at Exegol, went beyond mere description of this phenomenon. It framed the dyad in terms that resonated with Sith philosophy, while simultaneously suggested something older and more fundamental than the division between light and dark. The text spoke of two that are one and the power of two restoring balance. It described the dyad not as a tool for domination, but as a state of ultimate potential, the Force expressing itself through perfect unity between two beings. This prophecy fascinated the Sith precisely because it seemed to offer a path to unlimited power that bypassed some of the fundamental challenges they faced. The Sith philosophy emphasized individual achievement, the accumulation of power within a single being who would dominate all others. Yet this very individualism created inherent limits. One person, no matter how powerful, could only be in one place, could only focus on one task, could only wield one connection to the Force. The dyad promised to transcend these limitations without abandoning the concentration of power the Sith prized. But there was a problem, one that would frustrate Sith lords for millennia. The dyad, according to the ancient texts, could not be created through force of will. It was not a technique that could be learned or a ritual that could be performed. The prophecies suggested that dyads arose spontaneously, selected by the Force itself, according to criteria no mortal fully understood. This randomness, this lack of control, ran counter to everything the Sith believed about mastering the Force and bending it to their will. Nevertheless, countless Sith lords attempted to create a dyad anyway, convinced that sufficient power and knowledge could accomplish what the prophecy suggested was impossible. They experimented with Sith alchemy, tried to forge artificial bonds through dark side rituals, sought to link themselves to their apprentices through elaborate ceremonies. Each attempt failed, often catastrophically. The Force, it seemed, would not be commanded in this regard. The harder the Sith grasped for the power of the dyad, the more completely it eluded them. Darth Plagueis made perhaps the most sophisticated attempt to create a dyad that history records. His mastery of midi-chlorian manipulation, his deep understanding of the Force's mechanics, led him to believe he could engineer the conditions under which a dyad would form. Plagueis sought to create this bond with his own apprentice, Darth Sidious, reasoning that two Sith working in perfect unison while maintaining separate bodies and perspectives would represent the ultimate expression of dark side power. The experiment failed completely. Despite all his knowledge and power, despite manipulation of the Force at levels few had ever achieved, Plagueis could not force a dyad into existence. The bond he sought to create simply would not form. This failure haunted him, representing the one major limitation his powers could not overcome. In the end, his inability to create a dyad may have contributed to his death. Had he and Sidious truly been joined in the way the prophecy described, Sidious might not have been able to kill his master without destroying himself in the process. Sidious, after eliminating Plagueis, made his own attempt to create a dyad. He sought this connection with Darth Vader, believing that Anakin Skywalker's unique relationship with the Force might make such a bond possible. Here again, the attempt failed, though for different reasons. The trauma Vader had endured, the physical and psychological damage that defined his existence, seemed to preclude the kind of perfect unity the dyad required. Vader remained powerful, one of the most formidable Force users in galactic history, but he and his master never achieved the transcendent connection the ancient prophecy described. The repeated failures to create a dyad artificially led some Sith scholars to conclude that the prophecy represented a trap, an impossible goal designed to distract dark side practitioners from more achievable forms of power. Others maintained that the dyad was real, but required something the Sith fundamentally lacked. They pointed to the wording of the ancient texts, which emphasized balance and unity rather than domination and conquest. Perhaps, these scholars suggested, a true dyad required not just two powerful Force users, but two whose natures perfectly complemented each other, including the balance between light and dark. This last interpretation would prove prophetic, though not in a way any Sith anticipated. The Sith Eternal, the cult of dark side followers who served the resurrected Emperor Palpatine on Exegol, studied the doctrine of the dyad extensively. They believed that the dyad represented the future of the Sith, the key to unlocking the full potential of the dark side. They maintained that entire generations might pass before a true dyad was born, but when it finally appeared, it would herald a new age of Sith supremacy. The dyad did manifest, but not as the Sith Eternal anticipated. Rey, granddaughter of Palpatine himself, and Ben Solo, grandson of Darth Vader, shared a connection that matched the ancient prophecy's description perfectly. From the moment they first encountered each other, they could sense one another across vast distances. They could touch through the Force, could communicate instantly despite physical separation, could share power and even life itself. They were two halves of a dyad, bound together by forces beyond either's control or complete understanding. Crucially, this dyad united light and dark Jedi heritage with Sith bloodline in a way that transcended the ancient conflict. Rey embodied the light side even as she struggled against the dark tendencies inherited from her grandfather. Ben had turned to darkness, but carried within him the potential for light that never fully died. Together, they represented not the triumph of one side over the other, but the possibility of synthesis, of a connection to the Force that drew on both aspects of its nature. When they finally combined their powers, when Rey drew on the strength Ben offered, even as he gave his life to restore hers, the prophecy reached its fulfillment. The power they manifested in that moment exceeded anything the Sith Eternal had imagined. Rey absorbed Palpatine's dark lightning and turned it back on him with such force that it disintegrated the Sith Lord completely, ending the lineage that had persisted for 1,000 years. This was power born not of domination, but of unity, not of one crushing the other, but of two becoming truly one. The doctrine of the dyad, as it was carved into the walls of Exegol, remained unchanged, but its meaning had been transformed by the very fulfillment it described. The Sith had seen in it a prophecy of dark side supremacy, imagining a future where two Sith Lords would share power so completely that nothing could stand against them. What they failed to grasp was that the prophecy described not a Sith achievement, but the transcendence of the categories that defined Sith and Jedi as separate traditions. This transformation of meaning without change of text exemplified the nature of prophecy in the Star Wars universe. The words remained constant, carved in stone or preserved in holocrons, unchanging across the millennia. But their interpretation shifted with each generation, each reader bringing their own assumptions and desires to the ancient texts. The Sith read the doctrine of the dyad through a lens of power and domination, assuming the prophecy served their philosophy. They never considered that the prophecy might transcend their worldview entirely, might point to something beyond the eternal conflict between light and dark. The rule of two, a misinterpreted prophecy. Of all the prophecies that shaped Sith history, perhaps none had more profound immediate impact than the one that led Darth Bane to establish the rule of two. Yet the fascinating truth, revealed only through careful study of ancient texts and comparison of Sith writings, suggests that Bane based his most influential decision on a fundamental misinterpretation of the prophecy he had discovered. The rule of two, which would define Sith philosophy for a millennium, arose not from the text Bane thought he had read, but from a mistranslation of the far more ancient doctrine of the dyad. The story of this misinterpretation begins on Tython, ancient birthplace of Jedi philosophy and repository of some of the oldest Force-related texts in the galaxy. Bane, seeking knowledge to rebuild the Sith after the devastation of the Seventh Battle of Ruusan, journeyed to Tython in search of forbidden wisdom. There, among holocrons and writings that predated the formal schism between Jedi and Sith, he discovered text that would change everything. What Bane found was written in Ur-Kittet, the ancient Sith language he had studied extensively. The inscription he examined spoke of two beings, of power shared and amplified, of unity that transcended individual limitation. In Bane's reading, influenced by his own experiences and his desperation to find a solution to the Sith's self-destructive tendencies, he interpreted these words as a mandate for a new Sith structure. He read instructions where the text actually offered description. He saw prescription where there was actually prophecy. The critical error lay in translation and punctuation. Ur-Kittet, as previously discussed, relied heavily on context, inflection, and subtle markers that could completely alter meaning. The same sequence of symbols could mean two there should be, no more, no less, or two becoming one, power restored, balance achieved. The difference between these readings seems subtle, but it represents a fundamental shift in meaning. The first version describes a rule, a deliberate limitation of numbers. The second describes a phenomenon, a rare occurrence of unity. Bane interpreted the text as the first version. He came to believe that the ancient Sith had discovered a fundamental truth. That power was diluted when spread among too many, that the dark side could only be truly mastered when concentrated in the minimum number of practitioners. His rule was elegant in its simplicity. One master to embody power, one apprentice to crave it. When the apprentice grew strong enough, they would kill their master and take an apprentice of their own, ensuring that each generation grew more powerful than the last. What he missed, what would only become clear thousands of years later when scholars compared the Exegol texts with other ancient writings, was that he had encountered a description of the Force dyad. The two the prophecy spoke of were not master and apprentice bound by the Sith philosophy of betrayal and succession. They were two beings united by the Force itself, in a bond that made them more powerful together than either could be alone. The prophecy described cooperation and synthesis, not competition and succession. This misreading had profound consequences. Based on what he believed was ancient Sith wisdom, Bane created a system that would define his order for the next millennium. The rule of two ensured the Sith's survival by eliminating the internal power struggles that had previously torn them apart. It made them patient, forcing them to work across generations toward goals no single Sith would live to see completed. It made them focused, concentrating all their knowledge and power in just two individuals at any given time. But it also trapped them in a cycle of betrayal and violence that might have been avoided. The rule of two mandated that apprentices must eventually kill their masters, that this patricide was not just acceptable, but required for the Sith to continue. This created a paradox at the heart of the Sith tradition. Each master had to train their apprentice to be strong enough to kill them, but not so strong that they could do so prematurely. Each apprentice had to serve loyally while constantly planning betrayal. The entire relationship was poisoned by the certainty of its violent conclusion. Had Bane correctly understood the dyad prophecy, the history of the galaxy might have unfolded very differently. Instead of a rule of two based on succession through murder, he might have sought to create conditions where true dyadic bonds could form. Instead of forcing Sith to constantly undermine each other, he might have emphasized finding or creating partnerships where two Sith could work in genuine unity. The dark side would still have been dark. Sith philosophy would still have emphasized power and domination, but the internal dynamics of the Order might have been fundamentally different. Yet we must also acknowledge a paradox within this historical revision. Bane's misinterpretation, while based on an error, proved remarkably effective for the Sith's stated goals. The rule of two did make them stronger. It did allow them to survive when complete destruction seemed certain. It did lead eventually to the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Empire. In a strange way, the misread prophecy became self-fulfilling, creating a reality where Bane's interpretation worked even if it missed the original meaning. This phenomenon illustrates a deep truth about prophecy in the Star Wars universe. The accuracy of interpretation matters less than the conviction with which believers act upon their understanding. Bane believed absolutely in the rule of two, and that belief shaped his actions and those of every Sith who followed him. His certainty became their certainty. His misreading became their doctrine, and through 1,000 years of faithful adherence to this misunderstood prophecy, they made it true in a way that transcended its origins. The relationship between the doctrine of the dyad and the rule of two reveals itself clearly when the texts are placed side by side. The runes at Exegol, when properly translated with understanding of context and inflection, speak of unity and shared power. The formulation Bane created spoke of hierarchy and inevitable conflict. The original prophecy described a balance, a synthesis of two into one. Bane's version described a cycle of ascension through violence, where one rises only by destroying the other. Modern scholars examining this history have noted the linguistic markers that Bane missed or misinterpreted. The Sith language uses different grammatical structures for imperative commands versus descriptive statements. The Exegol text employs descriptive forms throughout, yet Bane read them as commands. The text describes a state of being, but Bane interpreted it as instructions for creating a system. The semicolons and breaks in the Orkitit version create meaning that shifts depending on where one assumes the breaks should fall. One particularly telling detail emerges from comparison of the texts. The phrase Bane translated as one to embody power, the other to crave it, appears to derive from a section of the Dyad prophecy, describing how two joined beings share different aspects of their unified power. In the original context, this described complementary roles within a unified whole, like two sides of a coin or two aspects of a single entity. Bane interpreted it hierarchically, as describing a superior and an inferior, a master and an apprentice. This hierarchical interpretation fit perfectly with Bane's own experiences and the cultural context of the Sith as he knew them. The Sith had always been organized hierarchically, with Dark Lords ruling over lesser Sith. With constant competition for supremacy, Bane's genius was not in inventing hierarchy, but in radically simplifying it, reducing the entire pyramid to just two individuals. Given his background and assumptions, his reading of the ancient text makes complete sense, even as it misses the deeper meaning. The irony deepens when we consider that Darth Sidious, the last Sith Lord to operate under the rule of two, did eventually discover the original Dyad prophecy in its proper form. The Emperor, obsessed with achieving immortality and ultimate power, studied every ancient text he could find. At some point, he must have compared Bane's formulation with the Exegol inscriptions and realized the discrepancy. He would have understood that the rule of two was based on a misreading. Yet Sidious did not abandon the rule of two, at least not formally. He continued to maintain the master-apprentice structure, even as he secretly trained additional dark side users and built the Sith Eternal cult on Exegol. He knew the truth about the prophecy, but he also recognized that the rule of two had served the Sith well for a millennium. Rather than completely overthrowing Bane's system, he chose to work within it while quietly preparing for what he saw as its evolution. Sidious's actions suggest he understood something profound about the relationship between the Dyad prophecy and the rule of two. Both spoke to the same fundamental insight, that power could be amplified through the right kind of partnership or succession. The Dyad achieved this through mystical unity, two becoming one in the Force. The rule of two achieved it through violent evolution, each generation surpassing the last. Different methods, but pointing toward the same goal of concentrated, overwhelming power. When Rey and Ben Solo finally manifested as a true Dyad, when they demonstrated the kind of unified power the original prophecy had described, it marked the end of both traditions. Their union transcended the rule of two by bypassing the need for succession through violence. They fulfilled the Dyad prophecy by achieving a connection that went beyond what any Sith had managed to create artificially. In doing so, they demonstrated both what Bane had missed and what he had accidentally discovered through his misreading. The rule of two stands as a monument to the power of misunderstood prophecy. It shows how even an incorrect interpretation, when believed absolutely and acted upon with total commitment, can shape reality. and achieve profound results. It demonstrates that sometimes the meaning we impose on ancient texts matters more than what those texts originally intended. It reminds us that prophecy operates not just through accurate prediction, but through the way believers respond to what they think they understand. In the end, both the doctrine of the dyad and the rule of two pointed toward the same truth, approached from different angles and understood through different frameworks. Power can be concentrated and amplified through the right kind of union between Force users. The ancient prophecy described this union as mystical and chosen by the Force itself. Bane's misreading created a system that achieved similar concentration through structure and succession. Both were right. Both were wrong. Both shaped the course of galactic history in ways their creators could never have fully anticipated. The grand plan, prophecy as blueprint. In the aftermath of the Seventh Battle of Ruusan, as Darth Bane stood alone among the ashes of the Brotherhood of Darkness, he did more than create the rule of two. He conceived something even more ambitious, a scheme so vast it would span generations, outliving him and every Sith Lord who would follow for the next 1,000 years. This was the grand plan, and while it would eventually be classified as strategy rather than prophecy, it functioned as both. It was a prediction of what would come to pass, a promise made to the dark side itself that the Sith would have their revenge. The grand plan began with a vision, though whether it came to Bane through the Force or through his own strategic brilliance remains debated by historians. He saw a future where the Jedi had fallen, where the Republic had crumbled, where a Sith Lord openly ruled a galaxy with none to oppose him. This vision seemed impossible. The Jedi numbered in the thousands. The Republic controlled most of known space, and the Sith had just been reduced to a single survivor. Yet Bane believed absolutely in what he had seen, and he understood that bringing this vision to reality would require patience measured in centuries. The genius of the grand plan lay in its acknowledgement of time. Bane recognized that he would not live to see the Jedi fall, nor would his apprentice, nor would many generations of Sith who came after. But this did not matter. The plan itself would be the immortality of the Sith, the guarantee that their purpose would survive even as individual Dark Lords rose and fell. Each master would teach the plan to their apprentice. Each generation would take one more step toward the ultimate goal, and eventually, inevitably, the accumulated work of centuries would bear fruit. At its core, the grand plan called for the Sith to corrupt the Republic from within rather than attack it from without. Bane had seen what happened when the Sith faced the Jedi in open warfare. They lost. The Jedi, for all their philosophical limitations, were skilled warriors backed by the resources of an entire galactic government. No Sith empire, no matter how powerful, could hope to defeat that combination through military might alone. But what if the Sith did not need to fight the Republic? What if they could make the Republic destroy itself? This strategic pivot represented more than military pragmatism. It embodied a deeper understanding of how power operates in complex societies. Bane recognized that the Republic's strength was also its greatest vulnerability. The vast bureaucracy, the competing political factions, the tension between member worlds, the distance between the Senate and the citizens it claimed to serve, all of these created opportunities for exploitation. A patient enemy one willing to work through manipulation rather than force, could turn the Republic's own systems against it. The early Sith who followed Bane took his vision and began to implement it with methodical precision. They infiltrated positions of power, not as obvious dark side users, but as respected citizens, as politicians, as business people, as entertainers and artists. They used their abilities in the Force subtly, influencing key decisions, nudging events in directions that served Sith interests. They sowed distrust of the Jedi, spreading whispers that the peacekeepers had too much power, that they interfered in politics they should avoid, that they took children from their families and indoctrinated them into an ancient religion. Darth Tenebris, who took on the public identity of the famous starship designer Rugus Gnome, exemplified this approach perfectly. As Gnome, he wielded enormous influence in galactic commerce and industry. He designed ships that would serve the Republic and private interests, all while ensuring that Sith agents could access or compromise those same vessels when needed. He used his wealth and connections to fund research into technologies the Sith would later use, all while maintaining the appearance of a respectable, if eccentric, businessman. No one suspected that one of the galaxy's most celebrated designers was also a Dark Lord of the Sith. Each Sith Lord added their own elements to the grand plan, refining it based on their unique circumstances and abilities. Some focused on economic manipulation, using banking systems and trade routes to create dependencies that could later be exploited. Others worked within the Senate itself, becoming or controlling senators who would argue for policies that weakened the Republic's foundations. Still others concentrated on cultural influence, shaping art and philosophy in ways that made citizens question the values that had sustained their society for generations. The brilliance of this approach was its resilience. If one Sith Lord schemes were discovered or failed, the overall plan remained intact. The next generation would simply adapt, find new angles of attack, new vulnerabilities to exploit. The plan was not a rigid sequence of steps that had to be followed exactly. It was a flexible framework, a general direction that allowed for countless variations in implementation while keeping the ultimate goal clearly in sight. Darth Plagueis brought new dimensions to the grand plan when he became Dark Lord. His mastery of the Force extended to areas his predecessors had not fully explored, particularly the manipulation of midi-chlorians and the fundamental mechanisms of life and death. Plagueis recognized that the grand plan, for all its sophistication, still relied heavily on traditional forms of power, political influence, economic control, military preparation. He sought to add something more fundamental, mastery over the Force itself at a level that would make the Sith truly unstoppable. Plagueis' contribution to the plan involved creating the conditions for a Sith Lord to rule not just through political power, but through virtual immortality. He reasoned that the greatest weakness of the grand plan was its dependence on succession. Each time one Sith Lord died and another took their place, there was risk. The new master might interpret the plan differently, might pursue their own ambitions at its expense, might lack the patience or commitment to continue work they had not initiated. If a Sith Lord could live indefinitely, they could see the plan through to completion personally, eliminating this source of uncertainty. His experiments with midi-chlorian manipulation, his search for the secrets of immortality, were not mere personal vanity. They represented his attempt to perfect the grand plan, to transform it from a multi-generational project into something a single, eternal Sith Lord could guide from beginning to end. In his vision, he would be that eternal Lord working with his apprentice Sidious to corrupt the Republic until the moment was right to strike. Then, with Plagueis still living to guide events, they would establish a Sith empire that could last forever. But Plagueis made a fatal miscalculation, one that demonstrated the limits of even the most carefully laid plans. He believed he could control Sidious, could trust his apprentice to remain loyal until the grand plan reached completion. He failed to account for the possibility that Sidious might see the plan differently, might recognize that Plagueis himself had become an obstacle to its fulfillment. When Sidious killed his master, he did so not in defiance of the grand plan, but in service to it, understanding that Plagueis' vision of eternal partnership had no place in a doctrine built on the rule of two. Darth Sidious became the instrument through which the grand plan finally reached fruition, though not exactly as Plagueis had envisioned. As Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, Sidious stood at the pinnacle of Republic power, controlling the very government the Sith had spent a millennium infiltrating and corrupting. He engineered the Clone Wars, a conflict that served Sith purposes regardless of which side won. The Separatists were led by Count Dooku, another Sith Lord. The Republic clone army was controlled through inhibitor chips that would eventually execute Order 66, triggering the Jedi Purge. The Clone Wars themselves represented the culmination of centuries of preparation. Every element of the conflict had been planned, or at least anticipated, by successive generations of Sith. The trade disputes that created tensions between core and outer rim worlds, the frustration of systems that felt underrepresented in the Senate, the corruption that made citizens question their government's legitimacy. All of these conditions had been carefully nurtured by Sith influence over the centuries. When Sidious finally triggered the crisis that led to war, he was not creating chaos from nothing. He was harvesting the fruits of seeds planted generations earlier. The execution of Order 66 and the subsequent formation of the Galactic Empire marked the grand plan's apparent completion. After 1,000 years of patient work, the Sith had indeed destroyed the Jedi Order and seized control of the galaxy. A Sith Lord ruled openly, no longer hiding in shadows, but commanding from the Imperial throne on Coruscant. The prophecy Bane had made to himself, the vision he had promised would come to pass, had been fulfilled down to its essential details. Yet here we encounter another paradox of prophecy and planning. The grand plan succeeded in all its stated objectives, but ultimately failed at its deeper purpose. Yes, the Jedi fell and the Empire rose. Yes, a Sith Lord ruled the galaxy with virtually unlimited power, but this success contained the seeds of its own destruction, as the prophecy of the Chosen One had always suggested it would. The very mechanisms the Sith used to achieve victory, the corruption, the fear, the oppression, created the conditions for the rebellion that would eventually overthrow them. Sidious, despite his incredible foresight and mastery of dark side visions, failed to see this coming. He believed that once the grand plan was complete, once the Sith had won their 1,000-year war, they would be secure in their power forever. He did not anticipate Darth Vader's redemption. He did not foresee that Luke Skywalker would refuse the dark side even under the most extreme pressure. He did not predict his own death at the hands of the apprentice he had corrupted and controlled for decades. This failure of vision illustrates a fundamental limitation of the grand plan and of Sith prophecy more broadly. The dark side granted its practitioners the ability to see far into the future, but it also blinded them to certain possibilities. The Sith could envision their own triumph because they believed absolutely in the rightness of their cause, in the inevitability of dark side supremacy, but they could not imagine genuine self-sacrifice, could not comprehend the possibility that someone would choose love over power, redemption over domination. These blind spots ensured that even the most perfectly executed plan would eventually encounter something its creators had not anticipated. The grand plan functioned as a living prophecy, one that shaped itself through the actions of those who believed in it. Unlike the ancient predictions carved in stone or preserved in holocrons, the plan evolved with each generation, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core vision. This flexibility made it more effective than a rigid prophecy might have been, but it also introduced unpredictability. Each Sith Lord's interpretation and implementation added new elements, some of which conflicted with what previous masters had envisioned. In the end, the grand plan achieved the Sith's revenge against the Jedi, but could not secure the eternal rule they sought. It demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed blueprint for the future remains subject to the principle that prophecy is always in motion, that no vision of what must come to pass can account for every variable, every choice, every unpredictable moment when someone decides to act against all expectation. The grand plan was both the greatest achievement of Sith prophecy and the ultimate demonstration of its limitations. Plagueis and the prophecy of immortality. Among all the Sith Lords who shaped galactic history, few approached the mysteries of the Force with the scientific rigor of Darth Plagueis. While other Dark Lords sought power through conquest or manipulation, Plagueis pursued something more fundamental: the ability to transcend death itself. His quest was driven by more than personal fear of mortality. He saw in the conquest of death the key to perfecting the grand plan, to ensuring that the Sith could finally achieve lasting supremacy over the galaxy. Plagueis' approach to immortality was rooted in his understanding of midi-chlorians, those microscopic life forms that existed in symbiosis with all living cells and mediated the connection between living beings and the Force. While other Force users treated midi-chlorians as mysterious intermediaries to be honored or respected, Plagueis viewed them as components in a system he could analyze, understand, and ultimately control. He believed that if he could master the mechanisms by which midi-chlorians sustained life and connected beings to the Force, he could achieve genuine immortality. The prophecy that guided Plagueis' work was less a formal prediction preserved in ancient texts and more an understanding that emerged from his research. He came to believe that the Force itself, properly understood and manipulated, would grant immortality to one who achieved sufficient mastery. This belief was not entirely without foundation. The Jedi had discovered that certain Force users could maintain their consciousness after death, becoming one with the Force while retaining individual identity. Qui-Gon Jinn had pioneered this technique, and he had taught it to Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi. But the Jedi method of immortality did not satisfy Plagueis. Their technique required releasing attachment to the physical world, letting go of individual desires and ego, becoming entirely aligned with the will of the Force. This was the exact opposite of what Plagueis wanted. He did not seek to merge with the Force and lose his individual identity. He wanted to retain his physical form, his power, his ability to act upon the material world, all while extending his lifespan indefinitely. He wanted immortality without surrender, eternal life without the sacrifice the Jedi method demanded. Plagueis' research led him down paths that previous Sith had explored only superficially. He conducted experiments on living subjects, manipulating their midi-chlorians to extend life, heal injuries, even bring the recently dead back to life. His test subject, a Bith named Darth Venomous, who had challenged him for the title of Dark Lord, became the focus of his most extreme experiments. Plagueis killed Venomous, then used his power to resurrect him, studying the process carefully. He repeated this cycle multiple times, killing and reviving the same individual, learning more about the boundaries between life and death with each iteration. These experiments demonstrated that Plagueis had indeed achieved remarkable power over life and death. He could heal wounds that should have been fatal. He could sustain life in bodies that should have died. He could even, under specific circumstances, call someone back from death if he acted quickly enough after they passed. But he also discovered limits to what even his power could accomplish. Each time he revived Venomous, the process became more difficult. The body degraded, the midi-chlorians became less responsive, and eventually no amount of force manipulation could prevent the final death. This pattern revealed a fundamental truth that would shape Plagueis' understanding of immortality. The Force did not simply oppose death. It actively resisted attempts to circumvent the natural cycle of life and death. When Plagueis used his power to manipulate midi-chlorians in ways that violated natural law, the Force pushed back, making subsequent manipulations more difficult. It was as if the Force itself had a will, a purpose, and it would only tolerate so much interference before reasserting its own order. Plagueis interpreted this resistance as a challenge rather than a prohibition. He believed that a Sith Lord powerful enough, wise enough, could overcome even the Force's natural resistance. If the Force pushed back against manipulation, the solution was not to stop manipulating, but to become strong enough that the Force could not resist. This belief drove him to even more extreme experiments, even deeper exploration of midi-chlorian mechanics, even greater risks in his pursuit of ultimate power over life and death. His greatest experiment, the one that would have consequences far beyond anything he intended, involved an attempt to create life itself through direct manipulation of midi-chlorians. Plagueis, working with his apprentice Sidious, attempted to coerce the midi-chlorians into spontaneously generating a new life form, one that would be born entirely of the Force without any biological parents. They envisioned creating a being of incredible power, someone who would serve the Sith and help them achieve their goals. They saw this as the next step in the conquest of death, not just preventing death, but asserting dominion over life itself. The experiment failed catastrophically, though not in the way Plagueis expected. The Force did not simply resist their manipulation. It responded, creating life in a manner the Sith Lords had not anticipated and could not control. Somewhere in the galaxy, on the desert world of Tatooine, a child was conceived without a biological father. That child was Anakin Skywalker, and he possessed a midi-chlorian count higher than any being previously recorded in galactic history. Plagueis realized almost immediately that something had gone terribly wrong with his experiment. The Force had not simply allowed them to create life. It had struck back, using their own manipulation as the catalyst to create something they had not intended. The chosen one of Jedi prophecy, where Plagueis and Sidious had sought to create a servant for the Sith, the Force had created someone who would ultimately destroy them. The experiment that was supposed to prove Sith mastery over the Force instead demonstrated the Force's own power to shape events according to its own will. This realization terrified Plagueis in a way few things in his long life ever had. He understood that he had overreached, that in attempting to impose his will on the fundamental processes of life and death, he had triggered a response from the Force itself. The prophecy of the Chosen One, which he had always known about but never taken seriously, suddenly became urgent and real. The Force had responded to Sith manipulation by creating the very being prophesied to destroy the Sith. Despite this fear, or perhaps because of it, Plagueis continued his work on achieving immortality. He believed that if the Chosen One was destined to bring about the Sith's end, the only solution was to become unkillable, to achieve such complete mastery over life and death that no prophecy could touch him. He pushed his experiments to new extremes, testing the limits of what midi-chlorian manipulation could achieve. He also focused on healing himself, using his power to reverse the physical damage of aging, to restore his body to peak condition even as the decades passed. The irony of Plagueis' fate has not been lost on historians. For all his mastery of preventing death in others, for all his power to manipulate life at its most fundamental level, he could not save himself when his own death came. Sidious struck while Plagueis was vulnerable, using mundane physical violence to kill a master who could have healed almost any injury given time to concentrate. The very midi-chlorians that Plagueis had spent his life mastering could not respond quickly enough to save him when his apprentice's betrayal caught him off guard. In his final moments, as Sidious explained why Plagueis could not save himself, the dying Sith Lord learned the ultimate limitation of his own power. His ability to manipulate midi-chlorians required will, concentration, and time. When his body was damaged faster than he could direct repairs, when his consciousness was failing too rapidly to focus his power, the midi-chlorians reverted to their natural state. They could not act on their own initiative to save him. They were tools, not guardians, and tools cannot wield themselves. Plagueis' death marked the end of one approach to the prophecy of immortality, but not the end of the quest itself. Sidious, having witnessed his master's failure, pursued immortality through different methods. Rather than seeking to prevent death through constant manipulation of his living body, Sidious prepared contingencies for after death. He created clones of himself, vessels his consciousness could inhabit if his original body died. He studied essence transfer, the technique of moving one spirit from one physical form to another. He built the cult of the Sith Eternal on Exegol, followers who would preserve his knowledge and assist in his resurrection if needed. These preparations bore fruit when Vader threw Sidious down the shaft of the second Death Star. The Emperor's consciousness did indeed transfer into a cloned body on Exegol, achieving a form of the immortality that Plagueis had sought. But this success came with caveats that revealed the continuing limits of Sith power over death. The clone bodies were imperfect, degrading quickly under the strain of housing Sidious's powerful spirit. He required constant infusions of Force energy to maintain even basic functionality. He was alive, yes, but hardly in the triumphant immortal state he had envisioned. The prophecy of immortality that drove both Plagueis and Sidious ultimately proved to be a trap. Their quest to conquer death became an obsession that blinded them to other vulnerabilities. Plagueis' focus on preventing physical death made him vulnerable to betrayal by the one person he believed he could trust. Sidious's elaborate resurrection scheme gave him a degraded half-life that was barely better than true death, and it required him to pursue ever more desperate gambles to restore his power. In seeking to escape one prophecy, that of their eventual destruction, they walked willingly into another, that of the self-destructive nature of Sith ambition. The story of Plagueis and his quest for immortality demonstrates how prophecy and ambition intertwine in dangerous ways. He did not receive a specific prophecy promising him eternal life. Rather, he created his own prophecy through belief in his own power, through the conviction that the Force could be mastered completely. His faith in his own abilities became a kind of self-generated prophecy, one that promised success if only he worked hard enough, if only he pushed far enough, if only he refused to accept any limitation. This self-created prophecy failed because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Force's nature. Plagueis treated the Force as a tool, a source of power that could be fully controlled through sufficient knowledge and skill. He never grasped that the Force had its own will, its own purposes that might not align with what any Sith desired. When he attempted to impose his will on the Force itself, when he tried to command the fundamental processes of life and death, the Force responded in ways he could neither predict nor control. His prophecy of personal immortality became instead a prophecy of the consequences that come when power is pursued beyond all wisdom. The language of prophecy, or kitat, and interpretation. Understanding Sith prophecies requires more than simply reading their words. It demands deep knowledge of Ur-Kitat, the ancient language in which most of these predictions were originally recorded. This language, which originated with the Sith species on their home world of Korriban, possessed unique properties that made it simultaneously ideal for preserving prophecies and incredibly difficult to interpret accurately. The story of Ur-Kitat is itself a prophecy of sorts, a tale of how knowledge can be preserved and lost, how meaning can shift across centuries while words remain unchanged. Ur-Kitat, also called the Old Tongue by those who studied it, developed among the native Sith species long before the exiled Dark Jedi arrived on Korriban. The language reflected the Sith's connection to the dark side, incorporating sounds and structures that seemed almost designed to channel Force energy through speech. When spoken aloud, Ur-Kitat carried weight beyond its literal meaning, as if the words themselves contained power that resonated in the Force. This made it perfect for recording prophecies, which often dealt with concepts that defied simple description. The written form of Ur-Kitat employed a runic alphabet that modern scholars have struggled to fully decipher. Each symbol could carry multiple meanings depending on context, position, and the symbols surrounding it. The language lacked many of the grammatical markers that most tongues use to clarify relationships between words. There were no articles, no clear indication of singular versus plural in many cases, and verb tenses were conveyed through subtle modifications that could easily be missed or misread. This inherent ambiguity was not a flaw, but a feature of the language. The ancient Sith understood that prophecy dealt with possibilities, with futures that might or might not come to pass depending on countless variables. They crafted Ur-Kitat to accommodate this fluidity, creating a language where precision and vagueness coexisted, where a single phrase could correctly describe multiple outcomes simultaneously. A prophecy written in Ur-Kitat was not a single prediction, but rather a field of potential meanings, any of which might prove accurate depending on how events unfolded. The complexity multiplied when considering inflection and pronunciation. Ur-Kitat was a tonal language, meaning the same sequence of sounds could mean completely different things, depending on whether they were spoken with rising or falling pitch, with stress on the first or second syllable, with hard or soft consonants. Written Ur-Kitat often provided no guidance about how words should be spoken, leaving readers to determine pronunciation through context or intuition. This meant that a written prophecy might be pronounced in several different ways, each yielding a distinct interpretation. Emperor Palpatine himself commented on this property of Ur-Kitat in the texts he left behind, noting that a simple change in inflection can alter a prophecy completely, opening ancient doctrines to a number of interpretations. He recognized that this linguistic flexibility had shaped Sith history, as different Dark Lords read the same ancient texts and came away with different understandings of what they said. The language itself ensured that prophecy remained contested ground, open to revision and reinterpretation with each new generation. The Galactic Republic's decision to ban translation of Ur-Kitat stemmed from recognition of the danger these texts posed. Republic scholars understood that Sith prophecies were not mere historical curiosities. They were active forces that continued to influence dark side practitioners thousands of years after being written, by making the language illegal to translate and programming protocol droids to refuse to render Ur-Kitat into other tongues. The Republic hoped to sever the connection between ancient Sith wisdom and potential modern followers. This prohibition had mixed results. On one hand, it did make Sith texts less accessible to the general population. Someone who stumbled across ancient runes carved into a temple wall could not simply ask their droid what they said. This prevented casual exposure to Sith philosophy and prophecy, keeping dangerous ideas from spreading widely. On the other hand, the ban made Ur-Kitat texts more valuable to those determined enough to learn the language themselves. The prohibition added an aura of forbidden knowledge that attracted precisely the sort of people most likely to be corrupted by what they found. Dark side cultists and would-be Sith devoted significant time to learning Ur-Kitat despite, or perhaps because of, its illegal status. This learning process itself served as a kind of initiation, separating casual dabblers from serious students of the dark side. Only those willing to spend years mastering a dead language's complex rules and exceptions, could access the prophecies in their original form. This ensured that Sith knowledge remained concentrated among those most committed to the dark side path. The language also served as a test of worthiness in another sense. Because Ur-Kitat required interpretation rather than simple translation, reading Sith prophecies demanded wisdom, insight, and understanding of context. Two scholars might read the same text and come away with entirely different understandings, both of which could be linguistically valid. The prophecies would not simply give up their secrets to anyone who learned the alphabet. They required the reader to bring understanding, to use their own knowledge of the Force and Sith philosophy to determine which of many possible readings made the most sense. This interpretive requirement created opportunities for both insight and error. A reader whose understanding of the Force was deep might perceive meanings in ancient texts that eluded others. They might recognize references to specific Force techniques or philosophical concepts that less educated readers would miss. But this same interpretive freedom also allowed readers to project their own beliefs onto the texts, to see in the prophecies confirmation of whatever they already believed or wanted to believe. Consider again the example of Darth Bane reading the text that led him to create the Rule of Two. His interpretation was linguistically valid. The Ur-Kitat could be read the way he read it, but it was not the only valid interpretation, and in fact, it appears to have missed the original meaning entirely. Bane brought to the text his own experiences with Sith infighting, his own frustration with the Brotherhood of Darkness, his own conviction that the Sith needed radical reform. These preconceptions shaped how he understood the ancient runes, leading him to see prescriptive commands where the text actually offered descriptive prophecy. The question of original intent versus interpretive freedom becomes particularly interesting when examining prophecies that have been fulfilled. Did the prophecy of the Sithari actually predict Anakin Skywalker's role in galactic history? Or did Anakin simply happen to fit a description vague enough to apply to many powerful individuals? Did the doctrine of the dyad foresee Rey and Ben Solo specifically? Or did it describe a general phenomenon that those two eventually exemplified? These questions have no definitive answers, because the nature of Ur-Kitat ensures that both possibilities remain valid. The survival of Ur-Kitat texts across millennia is itself remarkable and suggests the language possessed unusual properties. Many of these prophecies were carved into temple walls on worlds strong with the dark side, Korriban, Malachor, Exegol, and others. The dark side energy that permeated these locations seems to have helped preserve the inscriptions, preventing the erosion that would normally make ancient writings unreadable. Some scholars have suggested that the prophecies themselves, being descriptions of the future, were protected by that future, held in stasis by the events they described until those events came to pass. Holocrons provided another means of preserving Ur-Kitat texts. These devices, created by Sith Lords to store their knowledge and personalities, could maintain information for thousands of years without degradation. The interactive nature of holocrons added another layer to interpretation, as the gatekeeper, the personality imprint of the Sith who created the device, could provide context and explanation for the prophecies they contained. However, this also introduced bias, as the gatekeeper would interpret prophecies through their own understanding and assumptions. The relationship between written and spoken Orkitat also affected how prophecies were transmitted. Some Sith lords deliberately taught their apprentices incorrect pronunciations of certain prophecies, changing the meaning in ways that served their own purposes. An apprentice might spend years believing they understood an ancient prediction, only to discover much later that their master had misled them about how the words should be spoken. This was another form of the Sith tradition of lying to apprentices, using the language itself as a tool of manipulation. The punctuation and spacing in Orkitat texts added yet more complexity. Because many prophecies were carved or inscribed continuously with little or no break between words, readers had to determine where one word ended and another began. Placing these breaks in different positions could completely change meaning. A phrase that read as "two becoming one" might also be parsed as "two becoming one" or "two becoming one." Each reading suggested different prophecies, different outcomes, different understandings of what was foretold. Modern attempts to create definitive translations of major Sith prophecies have largely failed for these reasons. Scholars can provide multiple possible translations, can explain the various ways a text might be read, can contextualize the prophecy within Sith philosophy and history, but they cannot produce a single authoritative version that captures the original meaning, because the original meaning was deliberately multivalent. The prophecies were designed to resist simple translation, to remain open to interpretation across ages. This linguistic flexibility served the Sith well over their long history. As circumstances changed, as new challenges emerged, as different interpretations of Sith philosophy developed, the ancient prophecies remained relevant because they could be read in new ways. A prophecy written 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin could still speak meaningfully to Sith lords in the final days of the Republic, not despite its age, but because its language allowed it to accommodate new understandings. Yet this same flexibility created dangers. Dark lords could twist prophecies to justify actions that served their immediate interests, rather than any genuine fulfillment of ancient predictions. They could claim that their interpretation was the correct one while dismissing contradictory readings as errors or misunderstandings. The language gave them enough room to see in the prophecies whatever they needed to see, to find in ancient texts support for whatever they already intended to do. In the end, Orkitat stands as a monument to the Sith understanding of prophecy itself. The language recognized that the future was fluid, that prediction dealt with probabilities rather than certainties, that the meaning of events could only be fully grasped in hindsight. By creating a language that defied simple translation, that required interpretation and wisdom to understand, the ancient Sith ensured that their prophecies would remain living texts, continuing to shape and guide those who studied them across the millennia. Visions and Force sight among the Sith, prophecy among the Sith, was not confined to ancient texts and formal predictions carved in stone. Many Sith lords experienced visions, glimpses of possible futures that came to them through their connection to the dark side. These visions were more personal and immediate than the grand prophecies preserved in Orkitat, but they were no less significant in shaping Sith behavior and galactic history. Understanding how these visions functioned and why they sometimes led Sith astray reveals much about the nature of prophecy in the Star Wars universe. The ability to see the future through the Force was once common among both Jedi and Sith, though it became rarer as the centuries progressed. By the time of the Galactic Republic's final years, few Jedi regularly experienced clear visions of what was to come. Master Yoda was among the exceptions, though even he struggled to interpret what he saw and frequently warned others that the future was always in motion. Among the Sith, the ability seems to have persisted more strongly, perhaps because dark side practitioners actively sought these visions rather than waiting for them to arrive naturally. Darth Sidious stands out in Sith history as one of the most vision-prone Dark Lords ever recorded. His ability to peer into the future exceeded that of virtually any contemporary Force user, Jedi or Sith. Sidious used this gift to strategically plan his moves years in advance based on what he saw coming. His successful bid to become Supreme Chancellor, his manipulation of the Separatist crisis, his timing of Order 66, all of these relied heavily on his prophetic visions showing him the likely outcomes of various actions. But Sidious's visions were not infallible, and understanding their limitations helps explain both his successes and ultimate failure. Force visions, particularly those accessed through the dark side, showed possible futures rather than certain ones. They depicted what would happen if current trends continued, if key individuals made expected choices, if no major unforeseen elements entered the situation. In stable circumstances with few variables and predictable actors, these visions could be remarkably accurate. But when genuine wildcards entered the picture, when someone acted out of love rather than self-interest, when sacrifice trumped survival, when compassion overrode calculation, the visions failed. Sidious's greatest blind spot was his inability to foresee genuine selflessness. The dark side granted him visions that accounted for fear, hatred, ambition, and self-preservation. He could predict how people would act when motivated by these emotions because the dark side understood them intimately. But he could not see acts of pure compassion or self-sacrifice coming because these emotions lay outside the dark side's comprehension. When Vader chose to save his son rather than serve his master, Sidious's visions failed him completely. He had foreseen everything except the one thing that mattered most. This limitation was not unique to Sidious. It appears to have been a fundamental property of dark side visions throughout Sith history. Sith Lords could see their enemies' fear, their weakness, their likely defensive actions. They could not see heroism, could not predict when someone would choose principle over pragmatism. This blind spot created a pattern where Sith visions were most accurate when dealing with predictable, self-interested actors and least reliable when confronting Jedi or others who genuinely serve something larger than themselves. The prophets of the dark side represented an interesting variation on individual Sith visions. This cult, founded by Darth Millennial in rejection of Bane's Rule of Two, established themselves on Dromund Kaios and devoted themselves to studying the future through dark side techniques. They claimed to possess the gift of future sight, the ability to see coming events with remarkable clarity. Emperor Palpatine discovered them before the Clone Wars and brought them into his service, using their predictions to help plan his strategies. The prophets' techniques differed from the individual visions most Sith experienced. Where a lone Dark Lord might receive flashes of insight during meditation or dreams that hinted at future events, the prophets worked collectively, combining their abilities to achieve clearer and more detailed predictions. They claim to have foreseen both the destruction of the first Death Star and its successor, though notably they did not or could not prevent either event. This raises questions about the purpose of their visions. Were they meant to enable prevention or merely to provide foreknowledge of inevitable events? The prophet's existence also suggests that the ability to see the future might be strengthened through specific focus and practice. While they rejected Bain's rule of two, they maintained their own traditions and training methods specifically designed to enhance prophetic abilities. They lived in the Dark Force Temple on Dromund Kaas, a location strong with dark side energy, which may have amplified their connection to future possibilities. Their dedication to this single aspect of dark side power stands in contrast to most Sith Lords, who sought mastery across multiple Force disciplines. Darth Vader's relationship with Force visions provides another perspective on how this ability functioned among the Sith. Before his transformation, Anakin Skywalker experienced powerful prophetic dreams, most famously his visions of Padmé's death in childbirth. These visions terrified him precisely because they seemed so real, so inevitable. They drove him to actions that ultimately made the visions come true, demonstrating one of prophecy's great paradoxes. Sometimes, the very attempt to prevent a foreseen future causes that future to manifest. After becoming Vader, his prophetic abilities appear to have diminished significantly. Whether this was due to the physical trauma he had endured, the psychological damage of his transformation, or simply Sidious's overshadowing presence is unclear. Vader could still sense immediate dangers and nearby Force presences, but he seems to have lost the long-range foresight that had occasionally troubled his younger self. This suggests that prophetic ability might be fragile, vulnerable to disruption by trauma or other factors. The vision Vader eventually received through the eye of Webbish Bog, showing him possible futures involving his son Luke, marked a return of his prophetic abilities under unusual circumstances. This vision came not from his own power, but from an external source, a dark side relic that granted sight beyond normal capability. The fact that Vader sought out this artifact suggests he recognized the value of foresight and perhaps regretted losing the prophetic dreams he had experienced as Anakin. The nature of Force visions themselves deserves examination. They were not like recordings of actual future events, not glimpses through time at what would definitely occur. Rather, they seem to have been more like probability calculations performed by the Force itself, showing the most likely outcomes given current trajectories. The Force, which existed outside normal time, could assess all the variables in a given situation, the characters and motivations of key individuals, the momentum of large-scale events, the interaction of countless smaller factors, and project forward to see where things were heading. This explains why visions became less accurate the farther into the future they reached. Near-term predictions, dealing with situations where most variables were already set in motion, could be quite reliable. A Sith Lord seeing a battle about to happen tomorrow, with forces already deployed and plans already made, would likely see an accurate version of how that battle would unfold. But visions, reaching years or decades ahead, had to account for exponentially more variables, more opportunities for unexpected choices or random events to shift trajectories. The farther forward one looked, the more the vision became probability rather than certainty. The dark side's particular approach to visions also affected their character and reliability. Dark side visions tended to emphasize negative outcomes, to show futures filled with conflict, loss, and suffering. This was not because such futures were more likely than positive ones, but because the dark side resonated with fear, anger, and pain. A Sith Lord receiving visions through the dark side was like looking at the future through a filter that highlighted everything dark and threatening while de-emphasizing hope, redemption, or positive change. This filtering effect could be strategic. By showing practitioners the dangers they faced, dark side visions motivated action, spurred preparation, drove the paranoia and aggression that served Sith purposes. But it also created a skewed understanding of what was possible. Sith Lords planned for the threats they foresaw while remaining blind to opportunities that lay outside their vision's range. They prepared elaborate defenses against predicted attacks while leaving themselves vulnerable to unforeseen acts of compassion or sacrifice. The interaction between visions and free will created particular complications for Sith philosophy. The Sith rejected the idea of serving anything, including the will of the Force itself. They insisted that power came from imposing one's own will on the universe, from refusing to accept any limit or constraint. Yet their visions came from the Force, suggesting a future the Force itself showed them. How could they claim to control their own destiny when they were following paths illuminated by Force-granted visions? Different Sith Lords resolved this contradiction in different ways. Some treated their visions as intelligence rather than commands, as information to be used in service of goals they had independently chosen. Others saw visions as showing them the victories they were destined to achieve, transforming prophecy into promise. A few recognized the paradox and struggle with it, wondering whether their choices were truly their own, or whether they were unknowingly dancing to patterns the Force itself had laid out. The failure of Sith visions at critical moments throughout history suggests that the Force might indeed have its own will, one that could override or circumvent even the most powerful attempts to predict and control the future. Plagueis could not foresee that his attempts to create life through midi-chlorian manipulation would result in the Chosen One being born. Sidious could not predict his own destruction at Vader's hands despite his credible prophetic abilities. These failures occurred at precisely the moments when Sith power seemed most complete, suggesting the Force itself might intervene to prevent dark side practitioners from achieving final victory. In the end, Force visions among the Sith served both to strengthen them and to ensure their eventual downfall. The visions granted strategic advantages, allowed long-term planning, enabled the manipulation of events across decades or centuries. But they also created overconfidence, encouraged the belief that the future was knowable and therefore controllable, and blinded practitioners to possibilities that lay outside the dark side's understanding. The very tool that helped the Sith rise to power also ensured they could not maintain that power indefinitely, as prophecy itself guaranteed their destruction by showing them a future they could neither prevent nor fully comprehend. Lesser-known Sith prophecies. While the grand prophecies like the Sith Are and the doctrine of the dyad-dominated Sith thinking for millennia, numerous other predictions were recorded throughout their long history. These lesser-known prophecies, though not as influential as the major texts, reveal much about Sith culture, beliefs, and the various ways they attempted to understand and control their destiny. Many of these prophecies have been lost to time, existing now only as fragments referenced in other texts or whispered about in dark side cults. Others survived in surprising places, waiting for scholars brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The legend of Darth Rend exemplifies how even fragmentary prophecies could shape Sith belief and behavior. Rend, according to ancient texts, was a Dark Lord who lived at some point before the modern Sith era, though exactly when remains unclear. What made Rend significant was not his power during life, but what supposedly happened after his death. The prophecies surrounding him claim that after being killed by the Jedi Order, Rend returned from death to fight them once again. This narrative of resurrection and revenge resonated deeply with Sith philosophy. The prophecy of Rend's return was recorded in the holocron of prophecy that Qui-Gon Jinn accessed during his time as a Padawan. Young Qui-Gon, seeking to understand an ancient prediction he had encountered, opened this holocron and found himself confronted with numerous prophecies dating back 10,000 years. Among them was the prediction about Rend's resurrection. Qui-Gon initially believed this prophecy had already been fulfilled, that Rend had returned and been defeated again, and that the matter was settled. Only later would it become clear that the prophecy might have referred to a larger pattern, the cyclical nature of the Sith themselves, always returning after seemingly being destroyed. This interpretation transforms Rend's prophecy from a prediction about a single individual into a metaphorical description of Sith resilience. The Order had been killed by the Jedi multiple times throughout history at Ruusan after the Great Hyperspace War, during other conflicts spanning millennia. Yet, each time, the Sith returned, driven by the dark side's refusal to be permanently extinguished. Rend's individual resurrection became a symbol for this larger pattern, suggesting that the Sith as a concept could never truly die as long as the dark side existed. The prophecies carved into the walls of the Sith temple on Malachor represent another category of lesser-known predictions. Malachor, a world strong with the dark side, served as the location for an ancient superweapon powered by a massive kyber crystal. The temple walls were inscribed with Urkita texts describing dark rituals, forbidden techniques, and predictions about the destiny of those who mastered the knowledge stored there. These prophecies were particularly dangerous because they were tied to a specific location and the dark energy that permeated it. One of these Malachor prophecies apparently spoke of a coming darkness that would consume both Jedi and Sith, transforming the Force itself. The exact wording has been lost, as the temple was severely damaged during the battle that left Malachor a graveyard world, but references to this prophecy appear in texts from multiple Sith Lords who visited the planet before its devastation. They seem to interpret it as predicting a future where the old distinctions between light and dark, Jedi and Sith, would break down, replaced by something new. Whether this prophecy referred to the rise of the Empire, the eventual emergence of Force traditions that embraced both light and dark, or something yet to come, remains debated. The prophecies of Darth Andedu, one of the first beings to take the title Darth, have mostly been lost, but were clearly significant during his era. Andedu, who lived thousands of years before the modern Sith Order, was obsessed with immortality and created techniques for transferring one's essence from one body to another. His holocron, considered one of the most valuable Sith artifacts ever created, supposedly contained not just techniques, but also prophecies about the ultimate fate of those who sought to cheat death. Later Sith who accessed this holocron, including Darth Bane, spoke of warnings within about the price of immortality, though the specific predictions were never fully disclosed. What made Andedu's prophecies particularly interesting was their self-referential nature. He predicted that future Sith would seek his knowledge, that they would find his holocron and learn his techniques, and that each would believe themselves capable of succeeding where he had ultimately failed. The prophecy described a pattern that would repeat across the ages. Sith lords learning from Andedu, attempting his methods of essence transfer, and discovering that the technique carried costs and limitations they had not anticipated. In this way, Andedu's prophecies were less predictions of specific events and more descriptions of archetypal patterns that would recur throughout Sith history. The prophecies hidden on Exegol extend far beyond the well-known doctrine of the dyad. The Sith citadel on that hidden world contained libraries of ancient texts, walls covered in Urkitid inscriptions, and numerous artifacts associated with prophecy and prediction. The Sith eternal cult that inhabited Exegol dedicated much of their effort to studying and interpreting these prophecies, believing they held keys to restoring Sith dominance over the galaxy. Many of these predictions remain classified or unstudied, as scholars have only begun to examine the materials recovered from Exegol following Palpatine's final defeat. One Exegol prophecy that has been partially translated speaks of the final Lord who embodies all who came before. This prediction, which the Sith Eternal believed referred to Palpatine's resurrection, described a Sith so powerful that the spirits of all previous Dark Lords would reside within them, granting access to the cumulative knowledge and power of the entire Sith lineage. Palpatine himself made reference to this concept when confronting Rey, claiming that within him were all the Sith. Whether this was literal fulfillment of the prophecy or merely rhetorical flourish remains unclear, though the claim does align with other Sith teachings about how knowledge and power were supposed to accumulate across generations. Another category of lesser-known prophecies involves predictions made by individual Sith about their own apprentices or successors. These personal prophecies, passed from master to apprentice, shaped the relationships between Sith lords and influenced how they trained and tested their students. Darth Tenebrous, for instance, apparently foresaw elements of what his apprentice Darth Plagueis would accomplish, including his experimentation with midi-chlorians. These visions may have influenced how Tenebrous trained Plagueis, emphasizing certain areas of study while neglecting others. The prophecy concerning the cauldron that appeared in Count Dooku's Force vision while he was still a Jedi Padawan deserves mention as well. In this vision, facilitated by an encounter with enigmatic presagers of Hakote on Asusto, Dooku heard the voice of someone named Scry, claiming that the Sith were reborn and had activated a superweapon called the Cauldron, which then destroyed a planet. This vision troubled young Dooku deeply and may have planted seeds that would eventually contribute to his fall to the dark side decades later. What makes this prophecy particularly interesting is its ambiguity about whether it described a past event, a future possibility, or a metaphorical truth. Different scholars have interpreted it in different ways. Some believe the Cauldron was a literal superweapon that existed at some point in Sith history. Others think it represented a metaphor for the destructive power of the dark side itself, with the planet being destroyed serving as a symbol for the Republic or Jedi Order. Still others suggest the vision was deliberately sent to Dooku to begin his corruption, making it less a genuine prophecy and more a form of psychological warfare conducted through the Force. Prophecies associated with specific Sith artifacts form another category of lesser-known predictions. The Hand of Scry, an artifact eventually found by Jedi Masters Lena Costana and Sifo-Dyas, apparently carried with it prophecies or visions related to the return of the Sith. The exact nature of these prophecies is not fully documented, but they seem to have contributed to Sifo-Dyas' conviction that a great conflict was coming, ultimately leading him to commission the clone army that would serve the Republic and then the Empire. The prophecies contained within the mask of Exim Panshard, an ancient Sith viceroy, demonstrated how Sith artifacts could themselves become vehicles for prophetic visions. When worn, the mask apparently granted the wearer glimpses of possible futures, though these visions came at the cost of increasingly surrendering one's will to Panshard's residual consciousness. This created a terrible trap. The wearer might gain valuable foresight, but would gradually lose the ability to act on what they saw, as Panshard's spirit took greater control of their body and mind. Lesser-known prophecies also appear in the various Sith training texts and grimoires that survived across the millennia. These documents, created by Sith Lords to preserve their knowledge for future generations, often included predictions about how the dark side would evolve, how future conflicts would unfold, or how specific Force techniques might be refined or surpassed. These prophecies were more modest in scope than the grand predictions about the Sithari or the Dyad, but they shaped day-to-day Sith practice and training in important ways. One particularly dark category of lesser-known prophecies involved predictions about the consequences of Sith alchemy and experimentation. Texts warning about what happens when certain dark side rituals are performed incorrectly, prophecies about the mutations that result from specific alchemical processes, descriptions of the fate awaiting those who delve too deeply into forbidden knowledge. These served as both warnings and enticements for ambitious Sith who believed they could succeed where others had failed. The fate of many lesser-known prophecies illustrates the fragile nature of knowledge preservation in a society as violent and secretive as the Sith. Holocrons were destroyed in power struggles between rival Dark Lords. Libraries burned when Jedi forces attacked Sith strongholds. Apprentices killed the masters before learning all the prophecies they had to share. The Sith's own culture of betrayal and secrecy ensured that much of their prophetic tradition was lost, with each generation knowing less than the one before about what the ancient Sith had actually predicted. Yet enough survived to shape Sith behavior across thousands of years. Even fragmentary prophecies, half-remembered predictions, and visions of uncertain origin influenced how Sith Lords understood their place in galactic history. These lesser-known prophecies formed a vast background against which the major predictions operated, creating a culture where every Sith Lord existed in dialogue with ancient voices speaking through time, offering warnings and promises that might or might not prove accurate, but which could never be completely ignored. The Chosen One through Sith eyes. The prophecy of the Chosen One stands as perhaps the most significant prediction in Star Wars history, a prophecy that shaped the fate of the galaxy for thousands of years. While it originated with ancient Force traditions and was preserved primarily by the Jedi, the Sith had their own perspective on this prophecy. Their understanding of the Chosen One reveals much about how the same prediction could be interpreted in radically different ways depending on one's philosophical framework and relationship to the Force. The Jedi version of the Chosen One prophecy, as it was understood in the final years of the Republic, predicted that a being born of the Force would arise to bring balance. The Jedi interpreted this to mean the Chosen One would destroy the Sith, eliminating the dark side's corruption and returning the Force to its natural state of harmony. This interpretation aligned perfectly with Jedi philosophy, which viewed the dark side as an aberration to be overcome rather than a legitimate aspect of the Force to be acknowledged. From the Sith perspective, this Jedi interpretation represented wishful thinking at best and deliberate distortion at worst. Sith scholars who studied the prophecy, particularly those who had access to versions that predated the Jedi Order as it existed in the Republic era, argued that the original prediction was more nuanced than the Jedi claimed. They pointed to the prophecy's emphasis on balance as evidence that it described not the triumph of light over dark, but rather the establishment of equilibrium between them. This interpretation carried profound implications for Sith understanding of the Force and their place in galactic history. If the Chosen One was meant to establish true balance between light and dark, then the Sith were not aberrations to be eliminated, but rather necessary participants in the Force's grand design. The prophecy, properly understood, validated Sith existence and suggested that attempts to destroy them would inevitably fail because balance required both aspects of the Force to persist. The Sithari prophecy, as discussed earlier, represented the dark side's parallel to the Jedi Chosen One prediction. Both spoke of a being born of the Force who would wield tremendous power and fundamentally alter the galaxy. The similarities between these prophecies led some Sith scholars to conclude they were variants of a single, more ancient prediction that both traditions had inherited and then interpreted through their own philosophical lenses. This theory suggested that somewhere in the deep past, before the schism that created the Sith, there existed an original prophecy that both groups claimed as their own. The discovery that both prophecies might refer to the same individual, Anakin Skywalker, created fascinating complications for Sith ideology. How could the being destined to destroy the Sith also be the Sithari, the perfect exemplar of dark side philosophy? How could Anakin simultaneously bring balance to the Force in the Jedi sense and lead the Sith to glory as their prophecy predicted? These apparent contradictions troubled some Sith Lords while exciting others who saw in them opportunities for unprecedented manipulation and control. Darth Sidious's approach to the Chosen One prophecy exemplified Sith pragmatism. Rather than deny Anakin's status as the prophesied one, Sidious sought to control and redirect it. He believed he could corrupt the Chosen One, turning the very being meant to destroy the Sith into their greatest servant. This represented the ultimate expression of Sith philosophy, taking what should be the instrument of your destruction and transforming it into the instrument of your triumph. If Sidious could succeed, he would not just defeat the prophecy, he would co-opt it, making it serve Sith purposes instead. The plan worked, in a sense. Anakin did fall to the dark side. He did become Darth Vader. He did help destroy the Jedi Order and establish the Empire. From a certain perspective, Sidious had indeed corrupted the Chosen One and turned him into an agent of Sith dominance. Yet this success was temporary and ultimately illusory, as Anakin's final act of killing Palpatine and choosing redemption demonstrated. The prophecy found a way to fulfill itself despite Sidious's interference, suggesting that the Force itself could not be so easily manipulated. The Sith interpretation of the Chosen One prophecy also grappled with questions of predestination versus free will. If Anakin was prophesied to bring balance to the Force, did that mean his choices were predetermined? Was his fall to the dark side inevitable, or could it have been avoided if circumstances had been different? These questions troubled Sith philosophers who wanted to believe in individual power and agency, while also accepting the validity of ancient prophecies. Some Sith resolved this apparent contradiction by arguing that prophecies described potential rather than certainty. Anakin had the potential to be the Chosen One, but whether he fulfilled that role depended on the choices he and others made. Sidious's corruption of Anakin represented one path the prophecy could take, while his eventual redemption represented another. Both were always possible, and the ultimate fulfillment emerged from the interaction of prophecy, individual choice, and the larger currents of the Force. Other Sith took a harder deterministic line, arguing that everything that happened to Anakin, his discovery by Qui-Gon, his training by Obi-Wan, his fall to the dark side, his eventual redemption, was predetermined by the Force itself. From this perspective, Sidious's belief that he controlled Anakin was an illusion. The Emperor was merely playing a role assigned to him by the Force, helping to create the circumstances that would allow the prophecy to manifest. This interpretation was deeply troubling to Sith philosophy, which emphasized personal power and rejected the idea of serving anything, even the Force itself. The fact that Anakin ultimately fulfilled both the Jedi Chosen One prophecy and aspects of the Sithari prediction suggests that the truth lay somewhere between these extremes. He was both determined and free, both following a prophesied path and making genuine choices. He destroyed the Jedi Order, but also destroyed the Sith. He brought the dark side to dominance, but also restored balance by ending both extremes. His life demonstrated that prophecy and choice are not contradictions, but rather different aspects of how destiny operates in a universe where the Force exists. From the Sith perspective, Anakin's story represented both triumph and catastrophe. They had successfully corrupted the Chosen One, turned him into the feared Darth Vader, and used him to achieve their 1,000-year plan of destroying the Jedi and ruling the galaxy. Yet, This very success contained the seeds of their destruction, as Vader's love for his son proved stronger than his commitment to the dark side. The Sith had won every battle but ultimately lost the war, precisely as the prophecy they had tried to subvert had always suggested they would. The prophecy of the Chosen One also raised questions about whether such a figure might appear again. Was Anakin unique, or was the Chosen One a role that could be filled by different individuals in different eras? Some Sith believed that the Chosen One was a singular event, a one-time fulfillment of an ancient prediction that would never be repeated. Others argued that the prophecy described an archetype that might manifest multiple times across galactic history, with each age producing its own Chosen One to address its own imbalances in the Force. This latter interpretation gained some support from the way Rey emerged in the sequel era, seemingly manifesting powers and a connection to the Force that paralleled Anakin's own gifts. While Rey was not born without a father, as Anakin had been, her unique position as Palpatine's granddaughter who chose the light side created interesting echoes of the Chosen One narrative. Some scholars have suggested she represents a continuation or renewal of the Chosen One prophecy, bringing balance once again after Palpatine's resurrection threatened to undo what Anakin had accomplished. The Sith's ultimate failure to control or prevent the Chosen One prophecy reveals a fundamental limitation in their approach to prediction and manipulation. They believed that knowledge of the future gave them power over it, that understanding a prophecy meant they could subvert or redirect it. The Chosen One prophecy demonstrated that some predictions operate at a level beyond even the most powerful Sith's ability to control. The Force itself had a will regarding balance, and that will find expression through Anakin regardless of what the Sith did to try to corrupt or control him. Failed prophecies and broken visions. Not every Sith prophecy came true. Not every vision proved accurate. Throughout their long history, the Sith recorded numerous predictions that never manifested, visions that led them astray, and prophecies that proved so ambiguous or poorly interpreted that they caused more harm than benefit. Examining these failures reveals as much about the nature of Sith prophecy as studying the successful predictions does. The first category of failed prophecies involves predictions that were simply wrong, visions that showed futures that never came to pass. Darth Sidious himself experienced this on multiple occasions, despite being one of the most vision-prone Sith in history. His most famous miscalculation came aboard the second Death Star, when he told Luke Skywalker that everything was proceeding as he had foreseen. Moments later, Vader threw him down a reactor shaft, an eventuality Sidious clearly had not predicted. His visions had shown him Luke's corruption or death and the rebellion's defeat, but they had completely missed the possibility that Vader might betray him. This failure was not due to any weakness in Sidious's prophetic abilities. He genuinely possessed extraordinary power to see the future. Rather, it demonstrated the fundamental limitation of dark side visions discussed earlier. They could not account for genuine acts of selfless love. Vader's choice to save his son, which required accepting his own death, lay outside the boundaries of what Sidious's visions could perceive. The Emperor's prophecy failed not because he lacked power, but because the future he tried to see included elements his dark side connection rendered invisible. Darth Plagueis experienced a different type of prophetic failure when his experiments with midichlorians resulted in the conception of Anakin Skywalker. Plagueis had envisioned creating a being who would serve the Sith, someone born entirely of the Force and bound to dark side purposes. His prophecy, based on his understanding of how midichlorian manipulation should work, showed him succeeding in this goal. Instead, the Force responded to his manipulation by creating the Chosen One of Jedi prophecy, someone who would ultimately destroy the Sith rather than serve them. Plagueis' vision failed because he fundamentally misunderstood how the Force would respond to being manipulated. Some prophecies failed because they were based on incomplete information or faulty assumptions. The various Sith Lords who claimed to be the Sithari were not necessarily lying or deluded. Many genuinely believed they fit the prophecy's description based on their understanding of what it meant to be free of limits or to lead and destroy the Sith. Their prophecies about their own significance proved incorrect, not because they lacked power or achievement, but because they misunderstood what the ancient prediction actually described. Another type of failure involved prophecies that were technically accurate but practically useless. A Sith Lord might receive a vision showing them a danger, but not receive enough detail to identify when or how it would manifest. They would know betrayal was coming, but not from whom. They might see their own death approaching, but not have enough information to prevent it. These incomplete prophecies created paranoia and fear without providing the actionable intelligence that would make them valuable. The prophecy that apparently led some Sith to believe they could create a Force dyad through deliberate effort represents a failure of interpretation rather than a false prediction. The doctrine of the dyad accurately described a phenomenon that did eventually manifest. However, generations of Sith who tried to artificially create this connection failed because they misunderstood the prophecy's nature. They read it as instructions when it was actually description, seeing prescription where there was only prediction. Their attempts failed not because the prophecy was wrong, but because they approached it incorrectly. Temporal paradoxes created another category of prophetic failure. Sometimes Sith received visions of futures they then tried to prevent, and their very attempts to avoid the foreseen outcome caused it to happen. This was essentially what occurred with Anakin's visions of Padme's death. He foresaw her dying, took actions he believed would prevent it, and those very actions led to the future he was trying to avoid. Sith Lords across the ages fell into similar traps, where prophecy became self-fulfilling because their response to the prediction created the circumstances that made it come true. The limitations of language and translation also caused prophetic failures. Sith who interpreted Orokita texts without sufficient understanding of the language's nuances often came away with incorrect readings. Darth Bane's misinterpretation of the dyad prophecy as instructions for the rule of two worked out well for the Sith overall, but other such errors led to disasters. Dark Lords pursued goals based on prophecies they had misread, wasted resources on plans inspired by incorrect translations, and sometimes destroyed themselves trying to fulfill predictions they had never properly understood. Prophecies could also fail due to changing circumstances. A prediction might be accurate when made, but become obsolete as situations evolved. If a prophecy foresaw a particular outcome, assuming certain conditions remained stable, but those conditions then changed dramatically, the prophecy would fail. This type of failure was particularly common with long-range predictions. As the farther into the future a vision reached, the more opportunities existed for intervening events to alter trajectories. The breakdown of prophetic accuracy during major disturbances in the Force represented another failure mode. When massive events occurred, the execution of Order 66, the destruction of Alderaan, other moments when billions of Force-sensitive connections suddenly vanished. The resulting ripples through the Force disrupted ongoing visions and made new predictions extremely unreliable. Sith, who relied heavily on foresight, found themselves temporarily blind during these chaotic periods, unable to see what was coming next because the Force itself was in too much turmoil to provide clear glimpses of the future. Some prophecies failed because they described possibilities that remained forever potential, rather than becoming actual. The Force, existing outside normal time, could see multiple possible futures simultaneously. A vision might show something that could happen, that had a reasonable probability of occurring given current trends, but that ultimately did not manifest because choices were made or events unfolded differently than projected. These prophecies were not false when received, but never became true in reality. The most interesting category of failed prophecies involves those that Sith deliberately created as deceptions. Some Dark Lords fabricated prophecies to manipulate their apprentices, rival Sith, or even entire dark side cults. They would create fake ancient texts, plant false visions, or use Force techniques to make others believe they had received genuine prophetic insights. These manufactured prophecies were designed to fail because they were never meant to predict the future accurately. They existed only to control behavior in the present. The consequences of prophetic failure varied widely. Sometimes the failure was minor, leading only to wasted effort or embarrassment. Other times, it was catastrophic, resulting in death, defeat, or the collapse of carefully laid plans. Plagueis' prophetic failure regarding midi-chlorian manipulation eventually led to the destruction of the Sith Order. Sidious's failure to foresee Vader's betrayal cost him his life and his empire. These were not trivial errors, but fundamental miscalculations that undermined everything the Sith had worked for. Yet Sith philosophy regarding prophetic failure was remarkably fatalistic. They accepted that visions could be wrong, that prophecies might fail, that even the most powerful foresight had limitations. This acceptance stemmed from their understanding that the future was fluid, that it could be changed through application of sufficient power and will. A failed prophecy was not necessarily a sign of weakness. It might just mean that someone with sufficient strength had imposed their will on the situation, forcing reality onto a different track than the one originally foreseen. This perspective created an interesting dynamic where Sith simultaneously relied on prophecy and distrusted it. They sought visions of the future because such knowledge provided advantages in planning and manipulation. But they also recognized that any given vision might prove incorrect, might be outdated by the time events caught up with it, or might be deliberately misleading. The wise Sith Lord used prophecy as one tool among many, never becoming so dependent on visions that they lost the ability to adapt when predictions proved false. The study of failed Sith prophecies reveals that the relationship between prediction and reality is far more complex than it might initially appear. Prophecies did not simply describe futures that would definitely occur. They sketched possible outcomes, highlighted likely trajectories, and sometimes revealed the intentions of the Force itself. But between the moment of prophecy and the fulfillment or failure of that prediction lay countless opportunities for intervention, change, and the exercise of free will. Failed prophecies remind us that even in a universe where the Force exists and visions of the future are real, the future itself remains fundamentally uncertain. The legacy of Sith prophecy. As we reach the end of our exploration of Sith prophecies, it is worth reflecting on what these ancient predictions meant and continue to mean for the galaxy far, far away. The prophecies of the Sith Lords were more than mere curiosities or historical footnotes. They actively shaped galactic history, influenced the decisions of powerful individuals, and helped determine the fate of trillions of beings across thousands of years. The most obvious legacy of Sith prophecy lies in the events they inspired or predicted. The Rule of Two, based on Darth Bane's interpretation of an ancient text, structured Sith society for a millennium and enabled them to survive when complete destruction seemed certain. The Grand Plan, itself a kind of prophecy spoken into existence by Bane and refined by his successors, guided Sith strategy across generations and ultimately succeeded in bringing down the Jedi Order and establishing the Empire. The prophecy of the Chosen One, interpreted differently by Jedi and Sith, drove much of the conflict that defined the Clone Wars and the rise and fall of Palpatine's regime. But the legacy extends beyond these specific events to encompass larger questions about fate, free will, and the nature of power itself. The Sith prophecies forced those who encountered them to grapple with whether the future was fixed or fluid, whether knowledge of what was coming granted the power to change it, whether even the most powerful Force user could escape destiny or would ultimately be bound by it. These are not merely academic questions. They go to the heart of what it means to wield power in a universe where the Force exists. The Sith approach to prophecy, aggressive, manipulative, rooted in the belief that foreknowledge could be weaponized, stands in stark contrast to the Jedi philosophy of accepting what the Force revealed and trusting in its wisdom. This fundamental difference in approach reflected and reinforced the larger divergence between the two traditions. The Jedi sought to serve the Force, to align themselves with its will. The Sith sought to command it, to impose their own will on the universe regardless of what prophecy suggested was meant to happen. The ultimate failure of the Sith, despite their success in achieving most of their prophesied goals, suggests limits to the philosophy of prophetic domination. Yes, they destroyed the Jedi. Yes, they ruled the galaxy. Yes, they fulfilled many of the predictions they had spent millennia pursuing. But they could not make their rule permanent. They could not prevent the rise of a rebellion that would overthrow them. They could not foresee or prevent the compassion and love that would lead to Vader's redemption and their own destruction. This pattern suggests that the Force itself has limits to how much it will tolerate being manipulated or controlled. The Sith could bend prophecy to their purposes up to a point, but there came a moment when the Force's own will reasserted itself. The Chosen One prophecy, which the Sith tried to corrupt and control, ultimately fulfilled itself in a way that destroyed them. The doctrine of the dyad, which they tried unsuccessfully to create artificially for millennia, finally manifested in a pairing that used its power to end Sith rule forever. The legacy of Sith prophecy also includes all the knowledge lost when the Order finally fell. When Rey defeated Palpatine on Exegol, she destroyed the last Sith Lord and ended the continuous lineage that stretched back through Vader, through Sidious, through Plagueis and Tenebrous, and countless others all the way to Darth Bane. With that lineage went much of the accumulated wisdom about prophecy that the Sith had developed over the millennia. Future Force users who might have benefited from understanding how prophecy works, how to interpret visions correctly, how to distinguish genuine foresight from wishful thinking, all of them lost access to this knowledge when the Sith were finally destroyed. Yet some of that legacy survives in the form of texts, holocrons, and artifacts scattered across the galaxy. The Sith Citadel on Exegol remains, its walls still covered in ancient prophecies, waiting to be studied by scholars brave enough to visit that dark world. Other temples on Korriban, Malachor, and elsewhere contain additional texts and teachings about prophecy that survived the Sith's destruction. These remnants ensure that the Sith understanding of prophecy will not be entirely lost to history, though whether this survival is a blessing or a curse remains to be seen. The prophecies themselves contain another kind of legacy. Even after the Sith who recorded them are gone, the predictions remain, carved in stone or preserved in holocrons, waiting to be discovered and interpreted by future generations. Some of these prophecies may still be unfulfilled, describing events yet to come. Others might be reinterpreted in light of new circumstances, their ancient words taking on fresh meanings as the galaxy continues to evolve. The prophecies live on independent of those who created them, continuing to exert influence across time. Perhaps the most important legacy of Sith prophecy is what it teaches about the relationship between knowledge and power. The Sith believed absolutely that knowing the future granted power over it, that prophecy was a tool to be mastered and exploited. Their history demonstrates both the truth and the limits of this belief. Prophetic knowledge did grant advantages. It enabled long-term planning, allowed the manipulation of events across vast time spans, provided warnings about dangers and opportunities, but it did not grant unlimited power, did not guarantee success, and could not overcome the fundamental unpredictability that arises from free will and the Force's own purposes. The lessons about interpretation are equally significant. The way Bane misread the dyad prophecy as the rule of two, the way different Sith lords claimed to be the Sith Are, based on varying interpretations of what that meant, the way the Chosen One prophecy was understood differently by Jedi and Sith, all of these demonstrate that prophecy is as much about the reader as the text. What we bring to a prophecy, our assumptions and desires and fears, shapes how we understand it. This makes prophecy extraordinarily powerful, but also extraordinarily dangerous, as the same text can lead different readers to radically different conclusions and actions. The Sith legacy regarding prophecy also includes important warnings about the self-fulfilling nature of predictions. Anakin's attempts to prevent the future he foresaw led him directly into that future. The Sith's pursuit of immortality driven by a fear of prophesied destruction, created the very conditions that ensured their downfall. Prophecy and action exist in a complex relationship where attempting to avoid a foreseen outcome can make it more likely rather than less. This paradox plagued the Sith throughout their history and contributes to the tragic nature of their story. Looking forward, the question of whether Sith-style prophecy will arise again remains open. With the Order destroyed and their lineage ended, the specific tradition of Sith prophecy, as it existed for thousands of years, is gone. But the dark side remains, and with it, the potential for Force users to access visions and predictions through the same methods the Sith once used. New dark side practitioners might rediscover techniques for seeing the future, might find surviving Sith texts and learn from them, might develop their own approaches to prophecy that echo without exactly replicating what came before. The prophecies themselves, particularly those carved in lasting forms or preserved in durable holocrons, will continue to exist whether or not there are Sith to interpret them. Future Force scholars, whether they identify as Jedi, Darksiders, or something entirely new, will encounter these predictions and must decide how to understand them. The legacy of Sith prophecy thus extends beyond the Sith themselves to encompass an ongoing dialogue across time about fate, power, and the nature of the future. In the end, the prophecies of the Sith Lords stand as monuments to both the power and the limits of attempting to know and control what is yet to come. They demonstrate that visions of the future are real, that the Force does sometimes reveal what will happen before it occurs, that prophecy can provide genuine advantages to those wise enough to interpret and act on it correctly. But they also show that prophecy cannot be fully controlled, that attempts to dominate the future often backfire, and that the Force itself has purposes that transcend what even the most powerful Sith can foresee or manipulate. The story of Sith prophecy is ultimately a story about ambition meeting its match. The Sith reached farther than any other tradition in trying to master the future, to turn prophecy into a weapon, to use knowledge of what was coming as a tool for domination. They achieved remarkable success, bringing about the fall of the Jedi and ruling the galaxy for a time, but they could not make their triumph permanent, could not foresee all the ways their plans might unravel, could not prevent the prophecies they tried to control from ultimately destroying them. These lessons remain relevant for anyone who seeks power or tries to control their destiny. Prophecy offers knowledge, but not certainty. Visions show possibilities, but not inevitabilities. Understanding the future provides advantages, but also creates blind spots and false confidence. The wise approach to prophecy, whether in the Jedi or Sith tradition, involves holding these truths in balance, using foresight when it proves helpful while remaining humble about its limits, acting on visions when appropriate while staying flexible enough to adapt when they prove incorrect. The prophecies of the Sith Lords echo across the ages, speaking truths about power, destiny, and the complex relationship between knowledge and control. They remind us that the future is never entirely knowable, never fully controllable, always more complex than even the most powerful visions can capture. In a galaxy where the Force exists and prophecy is real, the greatest wisdom may lie not in seeking to master the future, but in learning to dance with it, to act with purpose while remaining open to possibilities no prophecy could foresee. Conclusion: we have journeyed through thousands of years of Sith history, exploring the prophecies that shaped their order and influenced galactic destiny. From the ancient prediction of the Sithari to the doctrine of the Dyad, from Darth Bane's misreading that created the Rule of Two to Darth Plagueis' doomed quest for immortality, from the intricacies of Ur-Kittit translation to the visions that guided and misled the Sith Lords across the ages, these prophecies reveal fundamental truths about power, ambition, and the nature of the Force itself. The Sith Lords sought to decode these prophecies, to understand them completely, to use them as tools in their pursuit of galactic domination. In many ways, they succeeded. Their prophecies guided them through millennia, helped them survive when extinction seemed certain, and ultimately enabled them to achieve their revenge against the Jedi. Yet in the end, the prophecies also ensured their destruction, as predictions they could not fully understand or control brought about outcomes they had not foreseen. The story of Sith prophecy teaches that knowledge of the future is both powerful and dangerous, that seeing what is coming can grant advantages while also creating blind spots, that even the most carefully studied prediction remains subject to the fluid nature of time and choice. The Force speaks through prophecy, but it does not speak simply or clearly. It offers glimpses of what might be, not guarantees of what must be. And those who seek to control these visions often find themselves controlled by them instead. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the lessons these ancient prophecies offer. Reflect on how the Sith Lord's certainty in their visions led them both to their greatest triumphs and their ultimate downfall. Think about what it means to seek power through knowledge, to try to control destiny through understanding it, to believe that seeing the future grants dominion over it, and remember that in the Star Wars universe, as in our own, the future remains ultimately unknowable, always in motion, forever surprising even those who believe they understand it completely. The prophecies of the Sith Lords endure, carved in stone on forgotten worlds, preserved in ancient holocrons, whispered by Force users who tap into the dark side's power. They wait to be discovered, to be interpreted, to shape the choices of future generations. They remind us that the past never truly dies, that ancient predictions continue to resonate across time, and that the eternal struggle between light and dark, between knowledge and wisdom, between power and compassion, plays out in every age. May the Force be with you as you contemplate these mysteries. If you found this exploration of Sith prophecies enlightening, consider subscribing to Sith Lore for more deep dives into the dark side of Star Wars history. Like this video if you enjoyed learning about these ancient predictions, and share your thoughts in the comments about which Sith prophecy you find most fascinating. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with visions both dark and illuminating, and may you wake with greater understanding of the prophecies that shaped a galaxy.